Snow muffled everything in the Ardennes, until it didn't. A German infantryman in a shallow foxhole felt the ground twitch, then split open, as shells arrived with timing that made no sense. No slow-ranging shots, no warning rhythm, just impacts, sudden, precise, and everywhere at once. Men who'd been advancing confidently seconds earlier stopped, not because they lacked courage, but because the rules had changed, and behind that invisible wall of steel was the moment the German plan for Bastogne started to die. Most people remember Bastogne for one word: nuts. The famous reply to a German surrender demand. It's iconic, it's real, and it's unforgettable, but that word didn't save the town. Something else did: speed, coordination, and a counter-move so aggressive it felt, from the enemy side, like the Allies had prepared the answer before the snow even began. Because the German bet in December 1944 wasn't just a military plan, it was a psychological wager. They bet the weather would blind Allied air power. They bet American units in the Ardennes were stretched thin. They bet the roads would clog. They bet a trapped town would run out of everything that matters: ammo, medicine, and hope. And they bet that if Bastogne was sealed tight, relief would arrive too late to matter. For a few days, that bet looked smart. Bastogne wasn't a glamorous objective. It was a crossroads town in Belgium. 7 roads, like spokes, radiating through frozen forest and rolling hills. In the Ardennes, roads weren't convenience. They were life. Whoever controlled the junction controlled movement, supply, and tempo. So when the Germans surged forward in the Ardennes offensive and wrapped around Bastogne, the town became a hinge. On one side, German armor and infantry trying to keep momentum. On the other, a pocket of American defenders ordered to hold, even as winter tightened its grip. Inside that pocket, there were no heroic music cues. There was cold. There was uncertainty. There were wounded men needing bandages that were running out. There were radios that worked, until they didn't. There was the constant math of rationing bullets. Outside, German commanders watched the map and saw something that should have been familiar: an encirclement, a shrinking ring, the slow exhaustion of the trapped force. Then came the surrender demand. 2 white flags, a typed message, a warning that the town would be annihilated if it didn't give up. The Americans replied with one word: nuts. That reply became legend because it sounds like pure confidence. But confidence doesn't move a tank column through winter roads. Confidence doesn't summon artillery ammunition out of mud and snow. Confidence doesn't reroute thousands of vehicles and supply trucks while an enemy offensive is chewing through your front. So if nuts wasn't the reason Bastogne held, what was? The answer begins hundreds of miles away from Bastogne, with an army that wasn't even facing that direction. Patton's Third Army had been oriented east, pushing toward Germany. Its logistics, its artillery plans, its fuel flow, everything was designed for forward pressure in that direction. When the Ardennes attack hit, the natural expectation was that shifting a large army to face north would take time, a lot of time. That's why what happened next felt unreal to German planners. It didn't fit their sense of what an army could do in winter. At a crisis meeting of Allied commanders, Patton promised speed, an attack north on a timeline that sounded reckless. Accounts describe him committing to a massive pivot and a fast counterattack window that shocked the room. Here's the part that matters for the ignored orders angle. Patton didn't win by disobeying a clear command to stand down. The real defiance was different. It was defiance of friction, defiance of weather, defiance of standard tempo. It was the refusal to accept that winter gets to decide what is possible. And he didn't do it with bravado alone. He did it with preparation. Days before the offensive fully erupted, his staff was already working contingency thinking, connecting indicators, reading the quiet across parts of the front, watching where German armored units seemed to be disappearing. That matters because it changes the story. It turns Patton got lucky into Patton was ready. It turns improvisation into pre-planned flexibility. Now, picture what a 90-degree pivot actually means. Not a metaphor, a real pivot. Road networks must be reprioritized. Units currently engaged must disengage or be held in place. Fuel routes must be changed. Ammunition dumps must be repositioned. Maps must be redistributed. Signal lines and communications must be rewired and rerouted. And every one of those steps is vulnerable to one thing: time. This is where the Germans believed they had the advantage, because their offensive was built on speed and surprise. If the Allies reacted slowly, the bulge would widen, supply lines would snap, and key towns would fall in sequence. Bastogne was supposed to be one of those towns. Instead, Bastogne became a trap, a magnet that forced German units to fight for a road junction they couldn't safely bypass, while Allied forces gathered to strike. And as the days dragged on, the weather became the silent killer of plans on both sides. Roads turned to mud, then froze. Fog and snow rolled in and out like curtains. Air power was grounded at critical moments. That's why one of the strangest elements of this story, strange, but real, is a prayer. Patton asked for a prayer for good weather, not as a public stunt, but as a morale tool. It was written down and distributed widely across the Third Army. In the middle of modern mechanized war, a general tried to change the sky with paper and faith. You don't have to believe in miracles to understand the psychology. A prayer card is a way to give exhausted men a sense that someone is fighting for them, even when the weather feels like an enemy. And then, eventually, the skies cleared. Visibility returned, air support and supply drops became possible again. But even before the sky cooperated, the ground war had already started to shift. Because while German commanders focused on sealing the ring around Bastogne, Patton's force was moving in a way the Germans didn't expect. Not one unit, not one lucky break. A system, combined arms moving together. Recon probing ahead. Artillery repositioned to support advances. Infantry riding with armor. Engineers handling obstacles. Staff officers feeding the machine with routes, fuel, timing. This is where the German soldier in that foxhole begins to feel something else. Helplessness. Not helplessness because he is outnumbered in that instant, but helplessness because the enemy's response feels coordinated beyond what you can stop at the front line. A tank you can aim at, a man you can shoot. A system-timed artillery, synchronized movement, supply that keeps arriving, feels like fighting the weather itself. At roughly the same time inside Bastogne, the defenders were living through their own kind of psychological warfare. The surrender demand wasn't just a request, it was a message. You're alone, nobody is coming. We can destroy you whenever we choose. The reply, nuts, was a refusal to accept that story. But the refusal had to be backed by reality. If relief didn't arrive, nuts becomes a punchline carved onto a grave marker. So everything hinged on one thing. Could Patton's Third Army actually break through? Here's what makes the relief of Bastogne such a perfect WW2 legacy-style story. It's not just courage, it's logistics. It's timing. It's staff work made visible in the shape of tanks arriving where tanks shouldn't be able to arrive that quickly. And that's where German expectations snapped. Because when relief came, it wasn't a gentle opening. It was a violent reintroduction of Allied strengths, artillery coordination, combined arms movement, and relentless pressure along approach routes. There's a detail from the relief narrative that says everything about why the Germans felt like they were being hunted rather than hunted. The coordination of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air was described as to perfection in an after-action context. That's the kind of phrase that doesn't appear when things are messy. That's the kind of phrase you write when separate arms are moving like one body. And if you're on the German side, you don't experience that as perfection, you experience it as inevitability. Now, let's talk about revenge. If you take revenge literally, you'll misread this story. Patton wasn't avenging a personal insult at Bastogne. The revenge was strategic. The German offensive tried to steal the initiative from the Allies late in 1944. It tried to reset the war's rhythm. Patton's countermove was revenge against the concept of German tempo. He didn't just respond. He counterattacked in a way designed to punish the enemy for overextending. That's why Allied leadership framed the bulge as an opportunity. Because a surprise offensive creates a bulge, and a bulge creates flanks. Flanks are where overconfidence dies. The German offensive created a salient that looked frightening on a map, but it also created a shape the Allies could crush, if they could hit from the sides fast enough. That's why speed mattered more than romance. This is the moment where German officers couldn't explain one detail, and it wasn't mystical, it was human. How did an army pivot in winter and still arrive with enough ammunition and coordination to keep attacking? That's the question that hangs over every German report of American effectiveness in late war. Why did the Americans keep arriving with more firepower than expected, more fuel than expected, more vehicles than expected? Because by late 1944, Allied logistics was not just good, it was doctrine. A unit in trouble didn't just hope for support, it called it, it received it, often faster than the enemy believed possible. And artillery was the language that made that speed visible. To a German infantryman, artillery isn't just explosions. It's the sensation that the enemy is watching you, that the enemy knows where you are, that the enemy can reach you without seeing you. A coordinated barrage feels like being judged. That's why the opening image, shells arriving with no warning, matters. It's not about gore, it's about terror. The terror of not being able to prepare, not being able to predict, not being able to protect yourself the way training promised you could. In older artillery systems, you'd often hear ranging shots first. You'd get seconds to flatten into the earth. With coordinated fires, those seconds vanish. And when those seconds vanish, the battlefield becomes psychological. Now, the relief itself, symbolically, is often summarized by a handshake. Two lieutenants, one from the relieving force and one from the defenders, meeting as the corridor opens. A simple gesture that means you are no longer alone. But the war doesn't stop for a handshake. The corridor has to be widened. The German forces don't evaporate. The bulge doesn't collapse overnight. Winter fighting continues, with counterattacks and grinding pressure until the offensive burns itself out. So why does this story matter enough to earn a title like The Revenge That Saved the Bulge? Because Bastogne wasn't just a town, it was a test. A test of whether German surprise could still break Allied operational control. A test of whether winter could neutralize Allied advantages. A test of whether American command could react at the speed modern war demanded. And Patton's pivot, executed by his army, his staff, and his logistics, helped answer that test. Not with slogans, with movement, with supply, with artillery that arrived on time, with combined arms that advanced as a single organism. If you're watching from the German side, it feels like this. One day you're sealing the ring and calculating surrender by exhaustion. The next day the ground shakes, the horizon flashes, and an American countermove that should have taken far longer is already biting into your flank. That's not just defeat, that's humiliation. It tells you something terrifying. The enemy can recover faster than you can exploit success. And once the Germans realized that, the offensive's psychological promise began to rot. Because the Ardennes gamble depended on a simple story. The Allies are slow, predictable, and fragile in winter. Patton's move broke that story. And when a war plan is built on a story, breaking the story is how you break the plan. So yes, Bastogne had nuts. But the bulge had something more dangerous from the German perspective. An Allied system that could pivot, coordinate, and hit back before you could finish your sentence. If you want more episodes where the enemy realized Allied superiority the hard way, through decisions, doctrine, and the systems behind the headlines, subscribe, and in the comments, answer this. Was Bastogne saved by Patton's boldness, or by the machine that made boldness possible?